The quarantine notice arrived in Silt H. Elder's archive queue at 400 station time, filed under routine administrative updates, between a water recycler maintenance log and a personnel rotation for outpost T Harville 9. That was the first thing wrong. A quarantine of 10 years does not end in a routine queue. Silt H. Elder set the notice aside and opened his observation feed for Nexus Outpost instead. The feed was low resolution, 64 hours delayed by relay lag, and he had been watching it for a decade without seeing anything worth noting. He had filed 3 reports in that time. The first said humanity appeared subdued. The second said humanity appeared to have accepted its situation. The third, filed 8 months ago, said humanity no longer appeared to be doing much of anything at all. He had considered that a satisfactory outcome. On the feed, a woman stood at a console. Her name was Elara Vance. He knew this from the personnel roster he maintained for Nexus Outpost, though he had never had occasion to note her specifically before. She held the rank of Station Coordinator, which was a Dominion-assigned title, meaning she was permitted to manage the outpost's internal systems and nothing else. She was the third person to hold the title in 10 years. The other two had died of unrelated causes. She was standing very still. The console in front of her displayed the same administrative notice Silt H. Elder had just received. Her right hand rested on the edge of the panel, fingers flat against the steel. Silt H. Elder noted this: the fingers were not moving. He noted it because his species, the Korath, had a word for the specific quality of stillness that a person exhibits when they have already decided what they will do next. The word did not translate cleanly into Dominion Standard. The closest approximation was something like readied wait, the stillness of a drawn bow, not a resting one. He did not apply this word to Vance. She was a coordinator on a quarantined human outpost. The Dominion fleet outside the boundary numbered 10,000 vessels. There was nothing she could have decided that would have mattered. He closed the feed and filed the quarantine notice under administrative closed actions and went to prepare his morning documentation. He was wrong about her. He would spend the next 7 years understanding how wrong. You'll want to hear how one woman ended a 40,000-year empire with a single keystroke. Trust me on that. This account is drawn from the personal archive of Silt H. Elder, senior chronicler of the Korath Continuance. Compiled in the 3rd year following the Dominion dissolution, it is submitted not as a celebration, nor as a tactical analysis, but as a correction. I recorded the quarantine of humanity as a concluded matter. The record was incomplete. What follows is the version I should have written. During the first 3 years of the quarantine, Silt H. Elder noted that Nexus Outpost transmitted fewer and fewer external communications. By year 4, the outpost had gone almost entirely silent on Dominion-monitored channels. He logged this in a report dated Cycle 7, 441, using the phrase characteristic withdrawal pattern consistent with species and sociological decline. He noted the shipyards at Cronus had also gone quiet. He noted the human population at the outpost had not decreased, which was statistically inconsistent with decline, but he explained this as a lag effect. He was explaining a great deal by year 4. The Dominion's VL liaison to the quarantine boundary, the functionary called Krull, filed the same pattern of observations in somewhat more nervous language. Krull's reports tended to run long. He had a habit of restating his conclusions in 4 or 5 different configurations, as though one of them might finally feel certain. His secondary throat pouches, visible in his documentation images, had maintained a low-level clamp for most of the quarantine's duration, the VL involuntary indicator of sustained unease. Silt H. Elder had never found Krull's unease useful. He found it now, reviewing those old files. Somewhat more interesting. On Cycle 7, 603, a Dominion deep scan of the quarantine's own detected an anomalous energy signature near the Cronus shipyard perimeter. The signature lasted 11 seconds and then disappeared. The Dominion's automated system flagged it, routed it to a review queue, and the review queue was processed 22 days later by a junior analyst who marked it unclassified natural variance and moved on. The analyst's name was Peldura Th. He was 26 years old and had been processing variance reports for 8 months. He had cleared 417 of them. None of the others had mattered. He had no reason to believe this one did. It was the Solara. Silt H. Elder first learned the name Solara from a Dominion tactical current 14 months after the quarantine lifted, retrospectively reconstructing events that had, at the time, gone entirely undetected. He read the record 4 times. Then he touched the base of his throat, which the Korath do when citing something they personally witnessed, though what he was citing here was his own failure to witness it at all. The Solara was a vessel of human construction, not large, by any comparative measure, roughly the mass of a Dominion mid-class courier. It had no Dominion registry, no transponder code, and its hull configuration matched nothing in the Dominion's recognition database because it had been built in the dark, in the interior of the Cronus shipyard, behind the sections that still showed up on external scans as inactive. The humans had been building inside the quiet parts. Thorn, the operative who captained the Solara during its first active run, left logs. Silt H. Elder has read all of them. They are written in the clipped, technical shorthand that characterizes human operational documentation, almost no adjectives, very little context assumed necessary. The first log entry for the Solara's initial deployment reads, in full departed Cronus 212, no contact, running dark, TSAVL Hari surveillance corridor, 6 days. Silt H. Elder had spent some time with that entry. 6 words of operational purpose. No statement of stakes. No record of what Thorn understood herself to be doing or what she believed would happen if she was caught. Simply the departure time, the status, the destination, the estimate. He had initially read this as evidence of a limited strategic imagination. He no longer read it that way. Thorn's log, compiled across what would eventually become 19 months of Whispercraft operations, documented 63 separate infiltrillion of Dominion administrative notes, each one surgical, each one targeted at a specific category of record, not military intelligence, not tactical infrastructure, not command protocols, historical archives, specifically records that the Dominion had expunged from its own public databases across a period of 30,000 years, atrocity documentation, suppressed census data from species that no longer existed, command orders that had authorized the kind of quiet population management that the Dominion's official history described, when it described anything at all, as voluntary resettlement and species-assisted transition. Thorn was not building a weapon. She was collecting evidence. The VL Hari delegate assigned to the quarantine boundary, not Krull, who had been rotated out by then, but a successor named Orathvel, received a courtesy briefing on Dominion security concerns during year 7 of the quarantine. Orathvel was present when a senior analyst mentioned, briefly, that there had been some anomalous network access at archival nodes, low level, probably automated legacy crawlers, nothing actionable. Orathvel tilted his head downward in the formal VL Hari acknowledgement before responding. His throat pouches were clamped tight. Has the quarantine boundary been reinforced? He asked. The analyst told him it had not been deemed necessary. Orathvel tilted his head again. He filed no report. He had, by that point, developed a theory about what the silence from Nexus Outpost actually meant, and he did not want the theory in writing. He had served in the Dominion's administrative structure for 31 years. He had learned, in that time, that some things were safer not to have documented. The data record Silt H. Elder found most difficult to process was not the Solara's infiltration logs, nor the extent of the archive Thorn had been compiling. It was simpler than that, and it arrived as a single line in Dominion Tactical Command Record 7 Epsilon, filed after an engagement near the Solara Station perimeter in year 8 of the quarantine. The engagement lasted 43 seconds. 3 Dominion cruisers had detected an unauthorized vessel at the boundary edge. They had moved to intercept per standing protocol. The engagement report, written in standard Dominion tactical notation, recorded their outcome as follows: vessels Cruiser Tersha N4, Cruiser Tersha N7, and Escort Corv in rendered non-functional. Unauthorized vessel withdrew into quarantine space. No Dominion survivors were covered. 43 seconds. Silt H. Elder had cross-referenced the firepower ratings of the 3 Dominion cruisers. He had looked at the mass estimate for the Solar A-class vessel. He had sat with the arithmetic for a while. He had then written, in his private working notes and not in any official record, a single line, They were not in decline. Here the account must address a question that Silt H. Elder has been asked many times since the dissolution, and that he has answered the same way each time. Why did no one in the Dominion's command structure connect these data points before it was too late? The answer is not incompetence. The answer is that the Dominion's entire administrative apparatus had been built across 40,000 years to not connect certain data points, to route anomalous signatures to junior analysts, to file atrocity records under access tiers that no one below a certain rank could reach, to describe silence as decline, and withdrawal as surrender, and a species going dark as a species going away. The Dominion did not fail to see humanity preparing. The Dominion had built itself a machine that could not see anything it did not already expect to find. This is the first data drop Silt H. Elder wishes he had understood sooner. 10 years of isolation, applied to a species that had decided to use the isolation rather than endure it, is not a sentence. It is a construction window. The Cronus shipyards, it would later be determined, had produced 31 vessels of Solar A class or greater during the quarantine period, all built behind the quiet faces of structures that still registered as inactive on external scans. The humans had learned, at some point, that a structure reads as inactive if the right panels face the sensors. They had kept those panels very clean. Silt H. Elder found this detail in a post-dissolution engineering survey. The survey noted it as an example of creative use of sensor equipment. He noted it as something else, evidence that 10 years of close observation by the most powerful empire in the galaxy had not been enough. Because the humans had not been hiding from the observation, they had been working around it. In year 9 of the quarantine, Ilara Vance requested a formal communication session with Krall's replacement, the VL liaison, or Rathvel. The request was unusual. Quarantine status species did not typically initiate formal sessions. The request went up through to administrative tiers before being approved, largely because no one could find a protocol that specifically prohibited it, or Rathvel agreed to the session. He arrived prepared for a negotiation, perhaps a request for resource supplement, perhaps a complaint about the quarantine's maintenance provisions. Vance had 3 items on her agenda. She moved through them in 11 minutes. The first was a technical notation about the water recycling output at Nexus Outpost, which she said had been running at 83% efficiency and could be improved with a parts requisition that she had already filed through the correct channels 18 months ago and was still pending. Or Rath VL's throat pouches gave a single, involuntary flutter. The second item was a request to reclassify 2 personnel records from the outpost's maintenance roster for administrative accuracy. The third item, Vance set a date, a card on the surface between them, slid it 3 centimeters toward or Rathvel, and said, "You might want to check your local history before the quarantine officially closes." She did not explain what that meant. Or Rathvel looked at the data card. His throat pouches clamped full closure. He did not touch it. After the session, he filed a report noting the meeting had covered routine administrative matters. He did not mention the data card. He did not know, at the time, exactly what was on it, but he had served in the Dominion for 31 years. And he knew the specific quality of stillness that a person has when they have already decided what they will do next. He had simply failed to know what to do with that knowledge. Silt H. Elder reviewed the Solara's full operational log in the months after the dissolution, working backward from the outcome to understand the sequence. He found the Coalition records in year 7, the first documented contact between Vance's network and representatives of species the Dominion had designated as assimilated or pacified, the T. Harville remnant, the Olesi enclave at Grid 9, 3 separate factions of VL Hari dissidents who had been filing bureaucratic objections to Dominion historical policy for decades through official channels and getting nowhere. The Coalition, on paper, was not impressive. The combined fleet tonnage of all affiliated groups did not approach 1% of Dominion capacity. The communication protocols were improvised. Several of the early sessions had to be conducted in relay chains because direct contact carried too much interception risk. Vance held them together by being the only person in the room who already knew what the archive contained. One of the T. Harville delegates, a woman named Saret who had lost 2 children to a Dominion resettlement action 20 years earlier, asked Vance during the 4th Coalition session how she was certain the archive would be enough. Vance refilled her water pouch from the console's reclaimer, took one sip, set it down beside the mute button on her panel. "You can't order ghosts to die," she said, "especially when they hold all your secrets." Surrett did not respond for a long moment. Her species, the T. Harville, had a gesture for acknowledgement that involved pressing two fingers briefly to the collarbone. She pressed them there and did not lift them for several seconds. The coalition's fifth session was larger than the fourth. The sixth was larger still. Silt H. Elder, reading these records now, returns to the image he first noted without understanding advance at her console. The quarantine notice on her screen. Fingers flat against the cold steel. He had watched her and seen a defeated species receiving news of its reprieve. He had been watching a drawn bow. The Dominion fleet outside the quarantine boundary numbered 10,000 vessels, had held position for months, and had orders to proceed with systematic reduction of all unsanctioned infrastructure within the quarantine zone the moment the administrative closing window expired. The orders had been drafted, routed, confirmed, and distributed. They were waiting on a timestamp. On the day the quarantine officially closed, Dance stood up from her console. The feed Silt H. Elder would later review showed her doing this rising from a seated position. Straightening, facing the main viewing screen. The screen displayed the quarantine boundary status lifted. Effective 400 station time. She did not look relieved. She looked at the screen the way a person looks at a clock when they have been waiting for it to reach a specific time. Then she reached across the panel, to the left of her main controls, and set her fingers on a small, worn toggle. The toggle was not labeled. Nothing on Vance's console at Nexus Outpost was labeled. Silt H. Elder would later note, except the systems that the Dominion's installation team had installed and labeled themselves. Everything Vance's people had added over 10 years, the supplementary inputs. The relay nodes built into spaces the Dominion schematics listed as empty conduit had no markings at all. The mute button had been on her console since year 3 of the quarantine. She had pressed it 11,214 times. Silt H. Elder found this figure in a systems log recovered from Nexus Outpost after the dissolution. The counter had been running since installation. The log did not explain why anyone had thought to install a counter on a mute button. He understood, eventually, that the counter was not for the button. It was for the practice. 11,000 times. She had rehearsed the motion, the reach to the left, the two-finger press, the specific quality of force required to fully depress the toggle without catching the adjacent relay input. 11,000 times? The result had been silence on Krull's channel. Once, the result was something else entirely. The Dominion fleet outside the quarantine boundary received its active orders at 401 station time. 60 seconds after the administrative closure of the quarantine took effect. The orders were routed through standard command channels, authenticated at 7 relay points, and confirmed by 3 separate fleet admirals before distribution. The system was designed to be airtight. The Dominion's command infrastructure had been refined across 40,000 years for exactly this purpose: the issuance and execution of orders that could not be misunderstood, delayed, or refused. At 401 station time, every vessel in the fleet received the orders. At 401 station time, every vessel in the fleet also received something else. The archive transmission originated from a relay node built into what the Dominion schematics listed as an inactive conduit in the interior of Nexus Outpost. The signal was not large. It did not need to be. It was formatted as a standard historical record packet, the kind that Dominion educational institutions received routinely. That military vessels were required to accept understanding administrative protocol because the Dominion had, 40,000 years ago, issued a mandate requiring all fleet vessels to maintain access to approved historical documentation for crew educational purposes. The mandate had never been repealed. No one had thought to repeal it, because no one had imagined that the historical documentation channel could be used to deliver something the Dominion had spent 30,000 years making sure did not exist in any accessible form. Vance pressed the mute button and 30,000 years began transmitting. Silt H. Elder has read the after-action accounts from 47 vessels that were part of the fleet outside the quarantine boundary that morning. He has read what the crews received, and he has read what they did with it. And he has had 7 years to process both. The archive was not a single document. It was 30,000 years of primary source material, command orders, census records, population management directives, communications between Dominion high officials across dozens of administrations, and, in several cases, the first-hand accounts of individuals who had documented what was happening to them in real time and then transmitted those accounts into the network with no expectation that anyone would ever retrieve them. Someone had been retrieving them for 19 months. The fleet's senior officers did not, as a general principle, have access to Dominion historical records above Tier 4. Most of them had never questioned this. The records below Tier 4 were complete and internally consistent, and there was no indication, from below Tier 4, that anything above Tier 4 existed. They were wrong about that. Fleet Commander Rail Toss received the archive transmission on the bridge of his command vessel, the Dominion cruiser Prevail, at 401 station time. He was 44 years old. He had served in the Dominion fleet for 22 years. He kept a paper logbook on the common bridge physical pages, not data, because he had a general distrust of auto-archiving systems that dated to an incident early in his career when a system error had deleted for months of his personal log and the backup had been unrecoverable. The logbook was open when the transmission arrived. He had been recording the fleet's readiness status for the morning's action. He read the first 14 pages of the archive before he set down his pen. He did not pick it up again. His second officer later reported that Toss had walked to the forward viewport and stood there for 11 minutes without speaking. The second officer had not interrupted him. The second officer had, by that point, also been reading. The cascade did not begin immediately. Silt H. Elder notes this because it is often misrepresented. The fleet did not mutiny in the first 60 seconds. The archive was large, and reading takes time, and the specific process by which a person's understanding of the institution they have served for their entire adult life comes undone is not instantaneous. It took 40 minutes. At 441 station time, Fleet Commander Toss opened a channel to the fleet's executive coordination node and transmitted a single line: all vessels hold position and await further order. He had the authority to issue that order. He did not have authority to issue it indefinitely. The Admiralty's command structure required confirmation of action within a 2-hour window from the time active orders were distributed. Toss had just created a 40-minute gap in the chain. Into that gap, 47 ships read further. At 447, a cruiser captain named Vela Andros, 29 years of service, specialist in fleet tactical coordination, transmitted a query to the Admiralty command node requesting clarification on the historical documentation just received. The query used the standard administrative language for flagging a records discrepancy. The Admiralty node received this query and routed it to a duty officer. The duty officer opened the query, saw what it was referencing, and went very still. 3 minutes later, the duty officer requested a supervisor. The supervisor requested a senior director. The senior director, Silt H. Elder notes, did not respond for 18 minutes. The senior director had been reading. Here the account must address a figure that has been cited in many subsequent analyses, but rarely with the correct context: the 43 seconds. This number predates the dissolution by 2 years. It comes from Dominion Tactical Com and Record 7 Epsilon, the after-action report filed following an engagement near the Solaris Station perimeter, in which 3 Dominion cruisers moved to intercept an unauthorized vessel and were rendered non-functional within 43 seconds. At the time, the record was classified above Tier 4. The fleet officers reading the archive that morning encountered it for the first time. 43 seconds to neutralize 3 cruisers. The fleet outside the quarantine boundary contained 10,000 vessels, but 43 seconds has a weight that 10,000 does not. 10,000 is a number. 43 seconds is a duration that every officer on every bridge had experienced personally, had watched the second counter on their display cross 43 ticks and understood in their body as a length of time that was not long at all. What Vance's coalition had built in the dark was not, in the end, what broke the Dominion's chain of command. What broke it was the arithmetic. What broke it was 47 officers doing the same calculation simultaneously. If one vessel of unknown type had done that in 43 seconds, and the humans had had 10 years to build more, and the archive was real, then what exactly had they been ordered to do this morning? And on whose behalf? And with what justification? The V. L. Hari delegate, or Rath Vel, stationed at the Boundary Administrative Post, received word of the fleet's communications suspension at 503. He was in his documentation office. He had, on his desk, a data card that he had kept in a locked drawer for 8 months without ever inserting it into a reader. He looked at the drawer for a long moment. He opened it. He inserted the card. He read for 6 minutes. Then he pressed his fingers to his throat, the V.L. Hari gesture of formal acknowledgement, and held them there. His throat pouches were fully extended for the first time in years, flared open, not clamped. The V.L. Hari involuntary indicator for profound and total recognition. He had served the Dominion for 31 years. He had known, for at least 8 of them, that something was wrong. He filed the Dominion's first formal acknowledgement of a record's irregularity at 509 station time. It was 17 words. It was the most consequential document he ever produced. The T. Harville delegates received word of the fleet suspension while aboard the Coalition's secondary coordination vessel. She was eating. A V.C.L. Hari intelligence contact had gotten a compressed signal out through a relay they had been maintaining for 2 years at significant personal risk. And the signal arrived while Sirette was finishing a meal she had started before the quarantine formally lifted. Because someone had told her it would be a long morning and she should eat something first. The signal said fleet holding. Admiral Tyne unresponsive. Archive confirmed distributed. Sirette set down her utensil. She pressed 2 fingers to her collarbone and did not move for a moment. Then she said, to no one in particular took them long enough. The OLSI coordinator on the other side of the table asked her what they should do next. Nothing, Sirette said. She picked up her utensil again. They're doing it to themselves. The OLSI coordinator's species had no specific gesture for the emotion it experienced in the following seconds. It had survived a Dominion resettlement action 40 years earlier. It had spent those 40 years in a grid enclave with access to nothing it had not been issued. It processed Sirette's words for a moment and then asked, with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to hope too quickly, how did she know they would read it? Sirette looked at the coordinator. She's human, Sirette said. They've been keeping records of everything that happened to them for 30,000 years. She just counted on the Dominion doing the same. The formal dissolution of the Dominion's Admiralty command structure was not announced. It did not need to be. By 800 station time, 63 vessels had filed independent suspension of orders notifications. By 1200, the number was 411. By the end of the cycle, the Dominion's fleet command network had received more unilateral suspension notifications than in the previous 40,000 years combined. The Admiralty's senior directors met in emergency session. The session lasted 6 hours. Silt H. Elder has read the transcript. The session was, in essence, a 6-hour argument about what to do with the archive, whether to deny it, whether to reclassify it, whether to issue a counter-narrative. The argument ended not because a conclusion was reached, but because the senior director responsible for the fleet's operational orders resigned from the session, formally and in writing, and filed a personal statement citing irreconcilable discrepancy between her oath of service and the documentary record she had spent the preceding 6 hours reviewing. Her name was Marin Toll. She was 61 years old. She had served in the Dominion's command structure for 38 years and had, in that time, authorized 26 fleet actions she had understood, at the time, as lawful and necessary. She did not, Silt H. Elder notes, understand them that way anymore. She was the 48th senior official to resign that day. By the end of the week, the number was 419. Vance was not at Nexus Outpost when the formal dissolution came. She was aboard a coalition vessel in the Primordial Rift, where the small fleet assembled from Solar A-class and allied ships had spent 31 hours holding a defensive perimeter against a Dominion advance force that had not received the suspension order in time or had received it and refused it, which amounted to the same tactical reality. The engagement at the Primordial Rift lasted 7 hours. Silt H. Elder does not narrate the engagement in detail. The Corps Reth do not narrate battles. They record outcomes, casualties, and the decisions that preceded them. The record shows that the coalition force was outnumbered by a factor of 14 and sustained losses that Vance's after-action report described, in characteristically flat language, as significant but within projected range. What within projected range meant she had known some of them would not come back. She had built the projection into her plan and proceeded anyway, which is a form of knowledge that Silt Elder finds, even now, difficult to process without touching the base of his throat. She had known what it would cost. She had done it anyway. That is not unknowing greatness. That is its opposite, the specific, deliberate weight of a person who has looked at the full cost of something and decided, with complete clarity, that it is worth paying. In the third year after the dissolution, when the new assembly was in its early formation and the question of what to do with the Dominion's historical records had become a matter of formal political debate, Silt Elder visited Nexus Outpost. It was no longer a quarantine station. The boundary markers had been taken down. The outpost had been offered to the human delegation as a site of historical significance, and the human delegation had, after some internal discussion, declined to make it a monument and instead converted it into an active research station. There were 17 species working there when Silt Elder arrived. The water recycler was running at 96% efficiency. Dance was not there. She was at the assembly, which was where she spent most of her time by then. She had been asked, repeatedly, to take a formal title in the assembly's structure. She had, repeatedly, declined. She attended as a consultant. She sat at the back of the chamber. She had, as far as Silt Elder knew, never spoken during a formal session. He had asked her, once, why she wouldn't take a seat. "I'm better at listening," she said. He had written this down. He had then asked her what she had been thinking, the morning the quarantine lifted, standing at her console with her fingers on the steel. She looked at him for a moment. Her expression did not change. "Nothing," she said. "I'd already done all the thinking." Vance's console from Nexus Outpost was preserved in the Outpost's records room after the conversion. Not displayed, not mounted, simply kept in a sealed storage case in a room that also contained backup data, cores and equipment logs, and a rack of old atmospheric calibration tools. The mute button was still on it. Silt Elder stood in that room for a while. He touched the base of his throat, because he had personally witnessed the console's last active use, through a 64-hour delayed observation feed, and because what he had seen was a woman reach to the left of her controls, press a worn toggle with 2 fingers, and change the weight of the next 4,000 years. He had watched it happen and recorded it as nothing. Outside the storage room, through the corridor window, 3 researchers from the T. Harville delegation were arguing about something in the data lab. He could hear them through the wall, quick, overlapping voices, the kind of argument that people have when they are genuinely interested in being right rather than simply not wrong. One of them laughed. Silt Elder listened to this for a moment. Then he picked up his recorder and began the document you are now reading. This account is filed under the official record of the new Assembly Historical Commission. Reference score Rath continuance submission for A. It is not a military history. It is not a tactical analysis. It is a chronicler's correction to his own prior record. The entry for humanity that Silt Elder filed at the end of year 4 of the quarantine red species designated H-class quarantine status stable. No indicators of concern. File inactive. He has since amended this entry. The amendment reads previous assessment incorrect. See attached. The attached document is this one. The document runs to 31 pages. And, on the final page, Silt Elder noted one last detail. He found himself unable to exclude the mute button on Vance's console had a press counter that ran to 11,214. But it had a second counter, installed on the same day, that no one had noticed during the post-dissolution survey because it was embedded 3 layers deep in the console's firmware and was not connected to any display. It ran to 1.